This chapter is called A Stroke of Bad Luck. And as we're getting near the end of the novel, I thought I would share a couple of other inspirational writers who have influenced my writing. One, Tom Robbins. I feel like, in a way, I've been walking in his footsteps, literally, because he's the age of my father. They both grew up in Richmond. They're both from the South. I ended up moving to Seattle. I worked for the Seattle PI. Everyone talked about this guy. I finally picked up his books, and the imagination is just incredible. And speaking of imagination, when Gabriel Garcia Marquez won the Nobel Prize for Literature, I immediately went out and bought this book, The 100 Years of Solitude. The fantasy, the imagination is just incredible. I read his second book, or another book of his. We'll talk about that one later. And so I had to go back and reread this one. So I read it right out of college, and I think just a couple of years ago. Just a wonderful imagination. Then, this is an unlikely one. This book came out when I was in college, and I didn't understand what the fuss was about, the Satanic Verses. The imagination of Salman Rushdie, it's incredible in his stories, and the worlds he creates is wonderful. In fact, all of his books, Midnight Children and The Enchantress of Florence. This was the first book of his that I read. And I read it shortly after it came out. I said, wow, this guy's great. No wonder he's so famous. He really is. So thank you to all of you for your inspiration. All right, let's get to our story. A Stroke of Bad Luck. Joe the paramedic, who breathed life back into her once, accompanied Sheila for her second ambulance ride to the emergency room, this time without pounding the heart beneath her breastplate. Last time, she staggered out of the ambulance as if nothing had happened, asking the paramedics, "Where are my clothes?" She lay prostrate on the gurney, her heart beating strongly, and with each pump of blood that rushed towards her head, some dripped, 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 like the leaky faucet her husband couldn't fix. Drip, drip, dripped, a plastic PVC water pipe punctured by oak tree roots beneath the ground. Her brain became soaked with blood, like a grape cluster ruined by a bird that pecks a hole in a single berry, sugary syrup oozing on the others. Her poor brain, dripped on, soaked, flooded, and as the fluid in her brain increased, her motor functions decreased, like Templeton the rat held at the bottom of a bucket of slop, gasping for a last breath, gasping for life, like the raccoon shot through the heart, mouth gaping, speechless at the spectacle, then gasping. There was no mercy for the rat, nor the bleeding fur coat, nor for the gray matter controlling Sheila's speech, facial expressions, and limbs. This time, a new passenger hopped into the back of the ambulance. Not Paul, who followed behind in his car. "Bluey, is that you?" panted her dog, who licked her face. "My beautiful boy." The words were unspoken, yet communicated between Bluey's spirit and what was left of Sheila's mind. Sheila's body was very much alive. When the paramedics arrived and met Paul in the house, they quickly determined she had a stroke, and Joe injected her with stroke buster medicine to slow additional damage. The hospital discharged her once without loss or injury, not even a broken rib after CPR. Could she escape again without harm? The MRI showed a grapeberry growing in her brain, and yes, leaking. The medical term diagnosed an aneurysm, a ruptured aneurysm. "I told her brain would explode if she didn't calm down," Paul said after the doctor told him the news. They rushed her to the operating room. The neurosurgeon inserted an ultra-thin catheter into her thigh, the catheter like the string she strung to demarcate rows of vines 10 years before. Sheila was good handling string, but nowhere near as good as this surgeon, a descendant of Indian snake charmers and rope masters who guided the string of life up through an artery navigating a fantastic voyage through her body and into her head, and then inserting the tiniest of coils to close the leak. This wasn't rotor-rooter, it was plugging the dike. Once plugged, Sheila's heart was still beating, and she breathed. They waited to see how she would recover. An alarm sounded, indicating disruption in cranial activity. "Her brain is shutting down," said the neurosurgeon. "I'm afraid we have to open her up." They prepared the saw, shaved her head, and cut through her skull. Once inside, the surgeon quickly found the source of bleeding and stopped it with a clamp. Then he sucked out the flood of blood with a miniature vacuum, and with the receding tide sawed damaged tissue. With experience and great skill, he probed the jelly with his fingers and snipped some here, snipped some there, removing the wreckage. He snipped again and, "Whoops," he said silently to himself, with trained temperament to keep the thought private, a major difference when Paul botched his operation on a grape. "No!" cried Sheila, unnoticed by the others. The surgeon, attempting to remove all the damaged tissue to restore Sheila to perfect health, had gone a snip too far. One little snip. Her heart was still beating, but breathing was on a ventilator. The surgeon broke the news to Paul. "She's brain dead." "No, I'm not!" Sheila screamed, unheard, pissed at the doctor for missing with his scalpel and diagnosis. "Go back to pack!" Pissed at her husband for causing her stroke. "I told you I needed a quiet life." The doctor outlined options. The preference was clearly stated in Sheila's living will and medical directives. Do not resuscitate. Do not prolong life artificially. But having to articulate that decision aloud, at the time called upon to do so, was not as easy as Paul thought it would be. His throat choked as he instructed the doctor to turn off the ventilator.